Welcome class to week 2 oral communications, COM 111, section 60. So for this week we're going to talk a little bit about a few different things within our research foundations unit, but for our first lecture we're going to go over bias in the media, what that means for you as students, and in general what you can do with this information once you're graduated. And so to begin this lecture, I'm going to show you all this slide. These are a few headlines, and I want you to take a few seconds, read them, and think to yourself, which of these headlines do you think sound like fake news? So I'm going to give you a few seconds to read these. Alright, so if you haven't read all of them, you can go ahead and pause this video, but the answer to which of these headlines is fake news is all of them. And so I want you all to think about that a little bit. Some of them you probably read, some of them you probably thought sounded very real, if not all of them. But that is just a little example of how deceiving fake news can be, and we're going to talk about that today so that you're able to identify which sources are biased and possibly fake to avoid those sources when you're researching. And so some of you may already know a little bit about bias, but we're going to talk about what is bias anyway. And so the definition of bias is favoring one side, position, or belief, being partial or prejudiced. So bias can be complicated in research because you want to focus on credible sources. And a lot of the times, if there's bias in a source, it's going to be favoring one position or one side, and that is going to sway the validity of the research source that you all will be reading. So we're going to talk today about how you can identify bias and how you can avoid it. So first, let's talk about bias versus propaganda. So bias is prejudice. It's a preconceived judgment or an opinion formed without just grounds or sufficient knowledge. So when someone has a bias, they may believe it's true based on past experiences, but there's no legitimate grounds on why they think a certain way. And propaganda, on the other hand, is a systematic effort to influence people's opinions to win them to a certain side or view. So a lot of time you'll see propaganda, especially within political campaigns. It's really a very distinct way in presenting information to influence someone's opinion to one side. And so let's talk about what is biased language and what is not, because a lot of times with biased language, that's how you're going to be able to tell if a source is bias or propaganda. And so here's a few examples. So this is an example of language that isn't biased. It's just an objective observation. So Frank spends very little money. So now let's take a look at a sentence that is biased favorably. So a sentence that would be in favor of biased is Frank is thrifty. So overall that's a positive adjective that we're using to describe Frank. And then an example of the same sentence that would be biased unfavorably, Frank is a cheapskate. So you can see that that adjective to describe Frank is a little bit more negative. And this first sentence, Frank spends very little money, that isn't a sentence that really sways an opinion one way positively or negatively. It's just an objective observation. So now we're going to talk about, can bias be found in the news? As some of you may know, absolutely. There's stereotypes that news sources are very biased. So to kind of think about that point, I'm going to show you all two sentences that could be used in a news story. So the first one, a crowd of more than 900 attended the protest. And now let's look at a different sentence. Fewer than 1,000 showed up to the protest. So as you can see, just by how a sentence in a news story is worded, that can change your bias on the subject that the news is talking about. So now I want you all to think about this. How could you say this in a neutral or unbiased way? A good example of how you could say this in a more neutral way is simply stating how many people showed up to the protest, avoiding the more than 900 or fewer than 1,000. Because as you could tell from that first sentence, a crowd of more than 900 attended the protest makes it seem like there was a large turnout. And then the second sentence, fewer, that keyword using fewer, makes it sound like the amount of people that showed up to the protest wasn't as big of a deal. And so now let's talk a little bit about how to detect bias. Bias isn't always on purpose. Sometimes it does just creep in. As humans, we typically have personal judgment. It's part of our nature, and oftentimes sources aren't biased on purpose. However, you do need to be aware of what bias is and different types of bias in order to become a better reader of a source so that you're able to formulate your own opinions and that they're educated opinions. So we're going to look at different types of bias through omission, placement, photos, names and titles, statistics, word choice and tone, and source control. So first let's talk about bias through omission. So sometimes certain facts or details will be cut out of a story, and other times others will be included. And this can really change how readers or viewers think about the story. So just think about that sentence we just talked about how many people showed up to the protest. If we were to admit how many people showed up to the protest, likely the reader wouldn't think anything about how large it was. They would just think, oh, a protest happened today. But if we go ahead and include, more than 1,000 people showed up to this protest, then that's likely going to persuade the reader to think, oh, that many people showed up, this protest must have been a big deal. So in order to prevent becoming victim to bias through omission, you're going to want to make sure to read several different sources to get the full story and to get a better grasp of what actually happened. And so with this slide, I want to show you a little bit of an example of bias through omission. So why, reading this headline, do you think maybe this is an example of bias through omission? Think about that for a few seconds. The headline states, more doctors smoke Camels than in any other cigarette. And so ultimately why this is an example of bias through omission is, even though that statistic at this time when this was published may be true, the adverse health effects of smoking were admitted. So from this article, during this time, you may think, oh, well, if doctors are smoking Camels, that must be the healthiest cigarette. Is kind of where my mind would go at first glance at this headline. But in reality, as we learned the adverse health effects of cigarettes, it's likely that doctors would actually not recommend smoking any type of cigarettes. So now let's talk about bias through placement. So usually the stories that are chosen to be put first on the headline, front page of a newspaper, are on the home page of a website, they're typically seen as more important. And then stories in the back of the paper or at the end of a news broadcast are seen as less important. Oftentimes, news media opens their news broadcast with a story to draw in the viewer's attention. We'll talk a little bit more about that as well. And so, as you can see from this picture with the 9/11 terrorist attack, that was the headlining story on a lot of different news sources, and during that time, we definitely focused on that event. And so, not saying that events that are put at the front are not important, but oftentimes there are other stories that are happening at the same time that other readers and viewers may feel are just as important depending on their personal views. And so here's a better example too to kind of show you how the placement of stories can change your feelings about the first page of a newspaper or news story. So this is the same news source, the New York Times. Same stories are placed on this front page, but as you can tell on the left, the headlining story is White Nationalist Protest Leads to Deadly Violence, with a graphic picture of some protesters getting hit by cars. And so right away, if you're looking at this source on the left, you're going to think, wow, something really negative is happening right now in the world, in America. But if you take a look at the example on the right, which is an edited version, someone used this as an exercise. Instead, they made the focus of the headline more of a positive. We see two people standing next to each other in a hug. So if you were to take a look at the news article over here on the right, you'd probably think, oh, something positive is going on in the world today, with the title Loving and Leaving America. Now, if you actually take a look at the story, it's not as positive as that picture may seem, but the point I'm trying to get across here is by placing photographs and stories in certain parts of a newspaper, certain parts of a website, can really change your emotions about what you feel like is happening in the world today. So with that, let's also talk about bias through photographs. So some photos can make the subject look serious, attractive, healthy, etc. Other photos can be really unflattering and make them look silly, ugly, sick, etc. So think about if you've ever taken a group photo with your friends. If you look away during the photo, you're likely going to argue, oh, that's a bad picture. But if your friend is smiling and was ready for the photo, they're likely going to like that picture because they look good in that photograph. And so the images of someone in the news can definitely influence how we think about them as well. So let's go ahead and take a look at some photographs that have been published in the past in the news. So let's first take a look at these photographs of John McCain. He did run for president a few years ago. All of these photos, he's smiling, looking into the camera, and you can tell he's ready for the photograph. It's more staged photographs. So let's compare these photos to these photos of John McCain. How does your perception of John McCain change based on the different sets of photographs? If I had to guess, with the series of these photos, you probably wouldn't take him as seriously. He's making a really funny face in the left photo and in the top right photo. And then even in that bottom right photo, it kind of looks like he's angry. So these photographs, compared to these previous photographs, you're probably going to have a very different perception of John McCain and who he is. So now let's talk about bias through names and titles. Similar to photographs, the way a person is described or labeled can influence how we think about them. So let's pull up an example. If we were talking about a specific person in a news article, if they describe John Doe as an ex-con is now running for office, compared to John Doe, who was convicted 20 years ago for a minor offense, is now running for office. The term ex-con likely has a lot more negative portrayal to John Doe than the next sentence, who was convicted 20 years ago for a minor offense, does. So that minor offense detail within this second sentence lets the readers know, okay, so it was a minor offense, maybe his background isn't as bad, maybe it's okay that he's running for office. But by simply stating with that first sentence, ex-con, that kind of lets your mind wander. Ex-con of what? Ex-con of murder? So as you can see, bias through names and titles really can change our perceptions of someone. And our fifth bias we're going to talk about is bias through statistics. So numbers and statistics absolutely can be manipulated to change the way we think about them. Let's go over an example. So with our first sentence, we have the fundraiser for the school earned only $1,100. With the second sentence, it reads, the school's successful fundraiser raised over $1,000. So as you can tell, using the word of only versus over changes the sentence dramatically. If you read a news article that just contained that first sentence, the fundraiser for the school earned only $1,100, you're going to automatically think, because they used the word only $1,100, oh, I guess that fundraiser wasn't that successful. But if you read that second sentence where they utilize raised over $1,000, automatically by using that word over, you're going to think, oh, over $1,000, that must be a lot of money in terms of what they were expecting to fundraise, so it must have been successful. Not only that, but in the second sentence, they did utilize the term successful, so automatically there's a more positive connotation, which that is also an example of bias through word choice, which is what we're going to talk about next. So the specific words and tone the writer uses absolutely influences a story. Using positive or negative words can change how we feel about the story, and we can also be influenced by a reader's tone of voice. So let's go ahead and look at an example. First sentence reads, the politician presented his well thought out and intelligent plan to Congress. While the second sentence reads, the politician presented his shoddy and disorganized plan to Congress. So automatically you can tell the first sentence uses a lot more positive word choice. Well thought out, intelligent. Those are positive adjectives to describe the politician's plan. But in the second sentence, the words shoddy and disorganized, those have very negative connotations. So if you read an article with this second sentence, you're probably going to automatically think, oh, this politician must not be a good candidate. He must not be very serious. While on the other hand, if you read an article that used the first sentence, you're probably going to have a more positive feeling towards the politician that the news source is talking about. And so we also have some more examples of word choice too. So for you sport fans out here, here's hockey game coverage headlines from the two hometowns of the opposing teams. So we definitely see this type of word choice differences in sports all over, whether it be professional sports or local sports. So as you can see for the Denver Post, the Red Wings 5 and Avalanche 3, injury begins, Avs tumble. But then in the Detroit News, they said Red Wings 5, Avalanche 3, Wings are too much for Avalanche. So go ahead and take a second and just think about how those different headlines change your feelings about how the game ended up. And so while this may seem somewhat of a tried example, especially since these sports writers do not pretend to be as unbiased as General's news writer, it still serves as a good example to plainly show the phenomenon of how word choice can really change and alter someone's opinion on the event that happened. Obviously, sports teams are always going to root and talk more positively about their home team, but just to give you all an example. So next we're going to talk about bias through controlling the source. So things to think about with this type of bias is, where does the story originate? Who is the source of the story? And whose point of view are you hearing or reading? And so to take this one into consideration, let's think about how would the information look if you interviewed each team during a murder trial? And what would happen if you only interviewed the prosecution for your article? So In the court system, the defense team and the prosecuting team are very obviously on different sides. And if we didn't have both a defense team and a prosecuting team, it would likely be very confusing for the jury for whichever trial, because the defense team is going to defend the murderer while the prosecuting team is going to defend the victim. So the information would likely look extremely difficult if you just heard one side of the murder trial. So now we've talked about the different types of bias. Let's think about what influences bias. So geography, ideologies, institutional affiliation, and what kind of medium is used often influences biases. So first, let's talk about geographical bias. So our perception of everyday life can vary from country to country. Therefore, our biases creep into what is reported very often. Let's take a look at an example. Based on a geographical bias, we have a few different sources here. So American sources such as CNN have labeled the conflict in Afghanistan as the war in Iraq. Now, in the contrast, Arab sources regularly call the conflict the war on Iraq. So it makes sense why the US would label it the war in Iraq and Afghanistan would label it war on Iraq, because as citizens of the United States, we're not seeing the war happening every day in front of our eyes. So we're going to call it war in Iraq. But for those who are living in Iraq, that is a very real conflict happening for them that they see every day. So they term it as war on Iraq, which makes total sense based on our geography. Something that may be really real for the people in Afghanistan is not as real as us, because we're not actually physically seeing it every day. Even though we know it exists, based on where we are at geographically, there's going to be an extreme difference in biases. And so second, let's talk about institutional affiliations, which is who you work for or groups to which you belong for. So for example, you all are students at State Tech, and so who is, or if there was an article written about State Tech from someone at State Tech, it's likely going to have a lot more details within that article, likely going to talk very positively. But if there was another article written about State Tech by our competitor, a different technical school, then there's probably not going to be as many details about State Tech, positive details about State Tech, because they're going to want students to come to their institution. So you have to think about who is paying the writer, and does the payer have a bias that the writer has to use? Unfortunately, a lot of times money comes into play with politics, breaking news stories, and so we really have to think about that. We see this especially in political groups and media that is liberal or conservative. So think about different members of different political campaigns. And when we do have an election year, we see a lot more political campaign commercials. And a lot of times, each candidate calls the other candidate a liar. So we have two candidates both saying that they're both liars. So then sometimes that makes you think, okay, so who is the liar? But what that comes from is that the commercial media group that is broadcasting a commercial for a specific political candidate is being paid by that political candidate likely a lot of money, so they're going to say whatever the political candidate wants them to say in that commercial, whether it's based on facts or not. And now we'll talk about the medium. Not all mediums of information are equal, so some mediums prevent information ready to digest, while with other mediums, one must be more careful while digesting information. So I kind of have a comparison here. Think about if you were reading the New York Times versus if you were watching the weather report from Ron Burgundy and Anchorman. Obviously, the platforms of those mediums vary exponentially. And so let's also think about a leading story from a 30-minute evening news program or the front page article of the New York Times newspaper. What would be the difference in how the same news might be reported? Video on TV might have a different impact than words describing the scene. Also, the length of an article may be able to give you more details. However, let's think about how might an article on a devastating earthquake be different on TV versus the newspaper. So on TV, you're likely going to see some video footage of an earthquake, and that might hit a little bit harder than just seeing a single photograph within the newspaper. However, within a newspaper, you're probably likely going to read a lot more details about, for example, how many power outages are affecting the citizens. So then that might hit home in a different way than just seeing the video of the storm surge. So now let's talk about media and the internet. The internet surrounds us at all times of the day. We are constantly connected. We have our phones, we have our laptops. We even have our friends texting us if there's a breaking news article that happens that's really affecting the nation on a national level. So while the internet's very low cost and it allows many people to publish news and articles, it also makes it easier for people with biases to put their view on the internet and makes it much harder for the reader to figure out what the bias may be. Think about, we all have that one Facebook friend, maybe it's a family member that posts very opinionated posts that might be different than our opinions, and they seem to be really extreme. We all have that person in our lives, so think about their posts and think about how, if you didn't know who they were, their personality, and they were working for a reliable news source, how that would really affect your own opinions on whichever situation they're sharing about at the time. And to kind of emphasize this, I did find a screenshot of a tweet, or a Facebook post, from a City of Fall River Police Department. And so they posted, "It is with regret that the Fall River Police Department's Facebook page was accessed by personnel who inadvertently reposted an opinion that was meant for their own personal account. The posting in no way represents the opinion of the Chief of Police or the Fall River Police Department." And so while we're not exactly sure what was posted because they had deleted it, the fact is that whoever posted a very opinionally charged post, people saw it. And they saw it coming from the City of Fall River Police Department. And that is crucial when you think about the medium and who's posting, because police departments do have they're leaders in communities, and so they're known to post things that are happening that are true ultimately. So when you have a police department that posts a very biased post, it can be alarming for citizens. So that's just kind of an example of how the internet, although it can be a great tool, it does make it a lot easier for people with biases to put their view, and then therefore it makes it a lot harder for us to know what's true, what's not, what's facts, and what's just opinion. And so now let's talk a little bit about unintentionally biased. So sometimes non-essential words are used simply just to make the language more colorful. Writers are not just deceitful word jugglers conspiring to make you think what they want you to believe. They are simply people who are trying to write to hold on to a job. So in being critical of word selection, be sure to keep that in mind. Also, sometimes unintentionally biased non-essential words can be used when someone is passionate about a specific topic. Maybe they find it exciting while others wouldn't find it so exciting. So they're going to typically use more colorful language. And so, once again, I have an example here at the bottom for a hockey team. Here on the left, we have a statement: "The Red Wings played the Flyers last night in a hockey game and they won 4-3. This is a very straightforward sentence. Seems very factual. Red Wings played Flyers, and here was the score. However, on the right, we have someone who wrote, "The Red Wings executed a decisive win, 4-3, over the tempered Flyers in last night's heated game of ice hockey." So right away, the sentence on the right is definitely more exciting. It uses more colorful language. But however, this can really change your perception on how that game went, because on the left, it just seems a simple hockey game, score was 4-3. But on the right, by using the adjective heated game of ice hockey, you're likely going to think that that game was much more exciting. Not to say that either one is right or wrong, but this is a good example of unintentionally biased, because if the writer was a Red Wings fan, they're going to be probably a lot more excited about the game than if they were a Flyers fan. Hence why they would state the facts a little bit differently. Now that we've talked about unintentional bias, let's talk about clear bias. So we all know that not all bias is easy to detect, but there are some media types that are always opinionated and meant to be biased. So you'll need to watch out for editorial pages, letters to the editor, political cartoons, and columns. These are always going to be biased. You should know when you see these types of sources, the intent is to be biased and to persuade the reader in one way or another. However, the purpose of opinion editorials or the editorial page isn't necessarily to deceive anyone, but it's to encourage thought and discussion, influence action, push for reform, provide background and analysis, and allow the community to have a voice. So I'm not trying to say that these types of sources are bad, but when you are doing research for academic research, you need to take into account that these sources are intentionally biased. And while you may read one of these sources, it will be a good idea to read another source that is more statistics driven and not as opinionated. So that's all that we have for today on bias in the media. Let me know if you all have any questions, and then I will post your assignment under your assignments module. Have a good day.